Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're continuing with our reading of the Srimad Bhagavatam. We're pretty far along in the third canto. Just now we're reading in chapter 28, and we're taking up where we left off just before the cow break. And that takes us to text 33. 33? Approved. Well, I remember reading about the great ocean made from the tears. So it must be 33.
Eyebrows too.
The eyebrows gave it away. Okay. But I can understand how you'd want to hear it again. Because it's one of my favorite purports. I mean, the poeticism of the ocean of tears from the crying of all the living beings is poignant. Samyapras? It's poignant, right? Yeah. And just thinking of how every living being has something, some agony, enough to cry. And if you collect all the tears since the time immemorial, it makes an ocean. When I was passing through Thailand, it was one of the routes I used to take years ago. I saw this Buddhist book, and it talked about how it was talking about samsara and karma. And it said, if you took all of the skeletons from just one living being, and how many lives just one soul has taken in this world, and you stack them one on top of the other, there would be enough to block out the sun. Because the living being has been in the material world for so long, has taken so many different births. It reminded me somewhat of that idea. Text 33. With devotion steeped in love and affection, the yogi should meditate within the core of his heart upon the laughter of Lord Viṣṇu. The laughter of Viṣṇu is so captivating that it can be easily meditated upon. When the Supreme Lord is laughing, one can see his small teeth, which resemble jasmine buds, rendered rosy by the splendor of his lips. Once devoting his mind to this, the yogi should no longer desire to see anything else. Purport. It is recommended that the yogi visualize the laughter of the Lord after studying his smile very carefully. These particular descriptions of meditation on the smile, laughter, face, lips, and teeth all indicate conclusively that God is not impersonal. It is described herein that one should meditate on the laughter or smiling of Viṣṇu. There is no other activity that can completely cleanse the heart of the devotee. The exceptional beauty of the laughter of Lord Viṣṇu is that when he smiles, his small teeth, which resemble the buds of jasmine flowers, at once become reddish, reflecting his rosy lips. If the yogi is able to place the beautiful face of the Lord in the core of his heart, he will be completely satisfied. In other words, when one is absorbed in seeing the beauty of the Lord within himself, the material attraction can no longer disturb him. Is that thing on back there? It's on? Okay. You put a little sign outside. It says no mosquitoes. 34. By following this course, the yogi gradually develops pure love for the Supreme Personality of Godhead Hari. In the course of his progress in devotional service, the hairs on his body stand erect through excessive joy, and he is constantly bathed in a stream of tears occasioned by intense love. Gradually, even the mind, which he used as a means to attract the Lord, as one attracts a fish to a hook, withdraws from material activity. I'm going to read it again. By following this course, the yogi gradually develops pure love for the Supreme Personality of Godhead Hari. In the course of his progress in devotional service, the hairs on his body stand erect through excessive joy, and he is bathed in a stream of tears occasioned by intense love. Gradually, even the mind, which he used as a means to attract the Lord, as one attracts a fish to a hook, withdraws from material activity. Here it is clearly mentioned that meditation, which is an action of the mind, is not the perfect stage of samadhi or absorption. In the beginning, the mind is employed in attracting the form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But in the higher stages, there is no question of using the mind. A devotee becomes accustomed to serving the Supreme Lord by purification of his senses. In other words, the yoga principles of meditation are required as long as one is not situated in pure devotional service. The mind is used to purify the senses, but when the senses are purified by meditation, there is no need to sit in a particular place and try to meditate upon the form of the Lord. One becomes so habituated that he automatically engages in the personal service of the Lord. When the mind forcibly is engaged upon the form of the Lord, this is called nirbij yoga, or lifeless yoga. For the yogi does not automatically engage in the personal service of the Lord. But when he is constantly thinking of the Lord, this is called sabij yoga, or living yoga. One has to be promoted to the platform of living yoga. One should engage in the service of the Lord 24 hours a day, as confirmed in the Brahma Samhita. The stage of premanjana churita can be attained by developing complete love. When one's love for the Supreme Personality of Godhead in devotional service is fully developed, one always sees the Lord, even without artificially meditating on his form. His vision is divine because he has no other engagement. At this stage of spiritual realization, it is not necessary to engage the mind artificially. Since the meditation recommended in the lower stages is a means to come to the platform of devotional service, those already engaged in the transcendental loving service of the Lord are above such meditation. This stage of perfection is called Krishna consciousness. Text 35. When the mind is thus completely freed from all material contamination and detached from material objectives, it is just like the flame of a lamp. At that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord and is experienced as one with Him. When the mind is thus completely freed from all material contamination and detached from material objectives, it is just like the flame of a lamp. At that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord and is experienced as one with Him because it is freed from the interactive flow of the material qualities. Purport. In the material world, the activities of the mind are acceptance and rejection. As long as the mind is in material consciousness, it must be forcibly trained to accept meditation on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But when one is actually elevated to loving the Supreme Lord, the mind is automatically absorbed in thought of the Lord. In such a position, a yogi has no other thought than to serve the Lord. This dovetailing of the mind with the desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is called nirvana, or making the mind one with the Supreme Lord. The best example of nirvana is cited in Bhagavad Gita. In the beginning, the mind of Arjuna deviated from Krishna's. Krishna wanted Arjuna to fight, but Arjuna did not want to. So there was disagreement. But after hearing Bhagavad Gita from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Arjuna dovetailed his mind with Krishna's desire. This is called oneness. This oneness, however, did not cause Arjuna and Krishna to lose their individualities. The Mayavadi philosophers cannot understand this. They think that oneness necessitates loss of individuality. Actually, however, we find in Bhagavad Gita that individuality is not lost when the mind is completely purified in love of Godhead. The mind becomes the mind of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The mind at that time does not act separately, nor does it act without inspiration to fulfill the desire of the Lord. The individual liberated soul has no other activity. Pratini vritta guna pravaha. In the conditioned state, the mind is always engaged in activity, impelled by the three modes of material world. But in the transcendental stage, the material modes cannot disturb the mind of the devotee. The devotee has no other concern than to satisfy the desires of the Lord. That is the highest stage of perfection, called nirvana or nirvana mukti. At this stage, the mind becomes completely free from material desire. Nirvana mukti. Yatarchi. Archi means flame. When the lamp is broken or the oil is finished, we see that the flame of the lamp goes out. But according to scientific understanding, the flame is not extinguished, it is conserved. This is conservation of energy. Similarly, when the mind stops functioning on the material platform, it is conserved in the activities of the Supreme Lord. The Mayavadi philosophers' conception of cessation of the functions of the mind is explained here. Cessation of the mental functions means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of the three modes of material nature. Keep going. What? It was a conservation of energy when the lamp goes out. That was more related to the nirvana, right? It was just it's a physics term, is all. Text 36. Thus situated in the highest transcendental stage, the mind ceases, and we can talk about it in a little bit. Thus situated in the highest transcendental stage, the mind ceases from all material reaction and becomes situated in its own glory. Transcendental to all material conceptions of happiness and distress. At that time, the yogi realizes the truth of his relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He discovers that pleasure and pain, as well as their interactions, which he attributed to his own self, are actually due to the false ego, which is a product of ignorance. Purport. Forgetfulness of one's relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a product of ignorance. By yoga practice, one can eradicate this ignorance of thinking oneself independent of the Supreme Lord. One's actual relationship is eternally that of love. The living entity is meant to render transcendental loving service to the Lord. Forgetfulness of that sweet relationship is called ignorance. And in ignorance, one is impelled by the three material modes of nature to think himself the enjoyer. When the devotee's mind is purified and he understands that his mind has to be dovetailed with the desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he has attained the perfectional transcendental stage, which is beyond the perception of material distress and happiness. As long as one acts on his own account, he is subject to all the material perceptions of so-called happiness and distress. Actually, there is no happiness, just as there is no happiness in any of the activities of a madman. So in the material activities, the mental concoctions of happiness and distress are false. Actually, everything is distress. When the mind is dovetailed to act according to the desire of the Lord, one has attained the transcendental stage. The desire to lord it over material nature is the cause of ignorance. And when that desire is completely extinguished and the desires are dovetailed with those of the Supreme Lord, he has reached the perfectional stage. Upalabdha parava kashta. Upalabdha means realization. Realization necessarily indicates individuality. In the perfectional liberated stage, there is actual realization. Nivritya means that the living entity keeps his individuality. Oneness means that he realizes happiness in the happiness of the Supreme Lord. I'll read this again. Nivritta means that the living entity keeps his individuality. Oneness means that he realizes happiness in the happiness of the Supreme Lord. In the Supreme Lord, there is nothing but happiness. Anandamayo bhyasad. The Lord is by nature full of transcendental happiness. In the liberated stage, oneness with the Supreme Lord means that one has no realization other than that happiness. But the individual still exists, otherwise this word, upalabdha, indicating individual realization of transcendental happiness, would not have been used. Text 37. Because he has achieved his real identity, the perfectly realized soul has no conception of how the material body is moving or acting, just as an intoxicated person cannot understand whether or not he has clothing on his body. Purport. This stage of life is explained by Rupa Goswami in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. A person whose mind is completely dovetailed with the desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and who engages 100% in the service of the Lord, forgets his material bodily demands. The body of such a liberated yogi, along with the senses, is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and it functions until its destined activities are finished. The liberated devotee, being awake to his constitutional position, and thus situated in samadhi, the highest perfectional stage of yoga, does not accept the byproducts of the material body as his own. Thus he considers his bodily activities to be like the activities of a body in a dream. Purport. The following questions may be posed. As long as the liberated soul is in contact with the body, why don't the bodily activities affect him? Doesn't he actually become contaminated by the action and reaction of material activities? In answer to such questions, this verse explains that the material body of a liberated soul is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is not acting due to the living force of the living entity. It is simply acting as a reaction to past activities. Even after being switched off, an electric fan moves for some time. That movement is not due to the electric current, but is a continuation of the last movement. Similarly, although a liberated soul appears to be acting just like an ordinary man, his actions are to be accepted as the continuation of past activities. In a dream, one may see himself expanded through many bodies. But when awake, he can understand that those bodies were all false. Similarly, although a liberated soul has the byproducts of the body, children, wife, house, etc., he does not identify himself with those bodily expansions. He knows that they are all products of the material dream. The gross body is made of the gross elements of matter, and the subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. If one can accept the subtle body of a dream as false and not identify oneself with that body, then certainly an awake person need not identify with the gross body. As one who is awake has no connection with the activities of the body in a dream, an awakened liberated soul has no connection with the activities of the present body. In other words, because he is acquainted with his constitutional position, he never accepts the bodily concept of life. What a useful analogy, isn't it? Practical. 39. Because of great affection for family and wealth, one accepts a son and some money as his own. And due to affection for the material body, one thinks that it is his. But actually, as one can understand that his family and wealth are different from him, the liberated soul can understand that he and his body are not the same. Purport. The status of real knowledge is explained in this verse. There are many children, but we accept some children as our sons and daughters because of our affection for them, although we know very well that these children are different from us. Similarly, because of great affection for money, we accept some amount of wealth in the bank as ours. In the same way, we claim that the body is ours because of affection for it. I say that it is my body. I then extend that possessive concept and say, it is my hand, my leg, and further, it is my bank balance, my son, my daughter. But actually, I know that the son and the money are separate from me. It is the same with the body. I am separate from my body. It is a question of understanding, and the proper understanding is called pratibuddha. By obtaining knowledge in devotional service or Krishna consciousness, one can become a liberated soul. 40. The blazing fire is different from the flames. The blazing fire is different from the flames, from the sparks, and from the smoke, although all are intimately connected because they are born from the same blazing wood. Although the blazing firewood, the sparks, the smoke, and the flame cannot stay apart because each of them is part and parcel of the fire, still they are different from one another. A less intelligent person accepts the smoke as fire, although fire and smoke are completely different. The heat and light of the fire are separate, although one cannot differentiate fire from heat and light. 41. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is known as Param Brahma, is the seer. He is different from the Jiva soul, or individual living entity, who is combined with the senses, the five elements, and consciousness. Purport. A clear conception of the complete whole is given herewith. The living entity is different from the material elements. And the Supreme Living Entity, the Personality of Godhead, who is the creator of the material elements, is also different from the individual living entity. This philosophy is propounded by Lord Chaitanya as Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. Everything is simultaneously one with and different from everything else. The cosmic manifestation created by the Supreme Lord by his material energy is also simultaneously different and non-different from him. The material energy is non-different from the Supreme Lord, but at the same time, because that energy is acting in a different way, it is different from him. Similarly, the individual living entity is one with and different from the Supreme Lord. This simultaneously one and different philosophy is the perfect conclusion of the Bhagavat school, as confirmed here by Kapila Dev. Living entities are compared to the sparks of a fire. As stated in the previous verse, fire, flame, smoke, and firewood are combined together. Here the living entity, the material elements, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are combined together. The exact position of the living entities is just like that of the sparks of a fire. They are part and parcel. The material energy is compared to the smoke. The fire is also part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. In the Viṣṇu Purana it is said that whatever we can see or experience, either in the material or spiritual world, is an expansion of the different energies of the Supreme Lord. As fire distributes its light and heat from one place, the Supreme Personality of Godhead distributes his different energies all over his creation. The four principles of the Vaishnava philosophic doctrine are Shuddha Advaita, purified oneness; Dvaita Advaita, simultaneous oneness and difference; Vishishta Dvaita, and Dvaita. All four principles of Vaishnava philosophy are based on the thesis of Srimad Bhagavatam explained in these two verses. 42. A yogi should see the same soul in all manifestations, for all that exists is a manifestation of different energies of the Supreme. In this way, the devotee should see all living entities without distinction. That is realization of the Supreme Soul. Purport. As stated in the Brahma Samhita, not only does the Supreme Soul enter each and every universe, but he enters even the atoms. The Supreme Soul is present everywhere in the dormant stage. And when one can see the presence of the Supersoul everywhere, one is liberated from material designations. The word sarva bhuteshu is to be understood as follows. There are four different divisions of species, living entities which sprout from the earth. living entities born from fermentation or germination, living entities which come from eggs, and living entities which come from the embryo. These 4 divisions of living entities are expanded in 8,400,000 species of life. A person who is freed from material designations can see the same quality of spirit present everywhere or in every manifested living entity. Less intelligent men think that plants and grass grow out of the earth automatically, but one who is actually intelligent and has realized the self can see that this growth is not automatic. The cause is the soul, and the forms come out in material bodies under different conditions. By fermentation in the laboratory, many germs are born, but this is due to the presence of the soul. The material scientist thinks that eggs are lifeless, but that is not a fact. From Vedic scriptures, we can understand that living entities in different forms are generated under different conditions. Birds evolve from eggs, and beasts and human beings are born from the embryo. The perfect vision of the yogi or devotee is that he sees the presence of the living entity everywhere. 43. As fire is exhibited in different forms of wood, so, under different conditions of the modes of material nature, the pure spirit soul manifests itself in different bodies. Purport: it is to be understood that the body is designated. Prakriti is an interaction by the 3 modes of material nature, and according to these modes, someone has a small body and someone has a very large body. For example, the fire in a big piece of wood appears very big, and in a stick, the fire appears small. Actually, the quality of fire is the same everywhere, but the manifestation of material nature is such that according to the fuel, the fire appears bigger and smaller. Similarly, the soul in the universal body, although of the same quality, is different from the soul in the smaller body. The small particles of soul are just like sparks of the larger soul. The greatest soul is the supersoul, but the supersoul is quantitatively different from the small soul. The supersoul is described in the Vedic literature as the supplier of all necessities of the smaller soul, nityo nityanam. One who understands this distinction between the supersoul and the individual soul is above lamentation and is in a peaceful position. When the smaller soul thinks himself quantitatively as big as the larger soul, he is under the spell of Maya, for that is not his constitutional position. No one can become the greater soul simply by mental speculation. The smallness or greatness of different souls is described in the Varaha Purana as Swamsha Vibhinamsha. The Swamsha soul is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the Vibhinangsha souls, or small particles, are eternally small particles, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Mamai Vamsha Jiva Loke Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. The small living entities are eternally part and parcel, and therefore it is not possible for them to be quantitatively as great as the Supersoul. Text 44. Thus the yogi can be in the self-realized position after conquering the insurmountable spell of Maya, who presents himself as both the cause and effect of this material manifestation, and is therefore very difficult to understand. Once again, thus the yogi can be in the self-realized position after conquering the insurmountable spell of Maya, who presents herself as both the cause and effect of this material manifestation, and is therefore very difficult to understand. Purport. It is stated in Bhagavad Gita that the spell of Maya, which covers the knowledge of the living entity, is insurmountable. However, one who surrenders unto Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, can conquer this seemingly insurmountable spell of Maya. Here also it is stated that the Daivi Prakriti, or the external energy of the Supreme Lord is durvibhavya, very difficult to understand and very difficult to conquer. One must, however, conquer this insurmountable spell of Maya, and this is possible by the grace of the Lord. When God reveals himself to the surrendered soul, it is also... One must, however, conquer this insurmountable spell of Maya, and this is possible by the grace of the Lord when God reveals himself to the surrendered soul. It is also stated here, Swarupena Vatishtate. Swarupa means that one has to know that he is not the Supreme Soul, but rather part and parcel of the Supreme Soul. That is self-realization. To think falsely that one is the Supreme Soul and that one is all-pervading is not Swarupa. This is not realization of its actual position. The real position is that one is part and parcel. It is recommended here that one remain in that position of actual self-realization. In Bhagavad Gita, this understanding is defined as Brahman realization. After Brahman realization, one can engage in the activities of Brahman. As long as one is not self-realized, he engages in activities based on false identification with the body. When one is situated in his real self, then the activities of Brahman realization begin. The Mayavadi philosophers say that after Brahman realization, all activities stop. But that is not actually so. If the soul is so active in its abnormal condition, existing under the covering of matter, how can one deny its activity when free? An example may be cited here. If a man in a diseased condition is very active, how can one imagine that when he is free from the disease, he will be inactive? Naturally, the conclusion is that when one is free from all disease, his activities are pure. It may be said that the activities of Brahman realization are different from those of conditional life, but that does not stop activity. This is indicated in Bhagavad Gita 18:54. After one realizes oneself to be Brahman, devotional service begins. Mad bhaktim labhate param. After Brahman realization, one can engage in the devotional service of the Lord. Therefore, devotional service of the Lord is activity in Brahman realization. For those who engage in devotional service, there is no spell of Maya, and their situation is all perfect. The duty of the living entity as a part and parcel of the whole is to render devotional service to the whole. That is the ultimate perfection of life. Thus end the Bhaktivedanta purports of the 3rd canto, 28th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Lord Kapila's Instructions on the Execution of Devotional Service. Bravo! Jai! Victory! And now we'll take a few reflections or questions. Mahendra Prabhu.
Srila Prabhupada is such a genius in explaining these very subtle concepts in so accessible way, and at the same time with these very relevant examples, just this last one. How can a diseased person be active and then one is healed will be inactive? Their idea that when you get free from the Prakriti, then there will be just awareness, no activity. And especially in the verses 34 and 5, when the Mayavadis specifically pick up this and say, you see, Bhagavatam is actually about, monistic understanding, because first you meditate on a form of Viṣṇu or a circle or a target or a round figure or whatever, and then the mind withdraws, and then you become one. Because the verses indicate this. But Prabhupada is just so simply, yes, you don't need the mind, because you have direct experience through service, and you don't need specifically using the mind to bring the form of the Lord. and your mind becomes one with the mind of the Lord. And it's such deeper and so profound, and it makes sense. Yes, there is oneness in that sense. And like Rupa Goswami also explains in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, at the stage of bhava, the mind does not stop, like the Mayavadis think, well, there will be no activity when there are no gunas, when you become liberated. But the mind is acting not under the gunas, but under the Chik Shakti, the internal energy. It's just moved by that energy. And that's why it's in a complete oneness. And it's such a brilliant explanation, and it's so soothing to the heart, and it's joyful from the beginning. We worship the Lord even with imperfect senses in the temple, in the mind, and then we have direct service and experience, and the Mayavadis are just so unlucky.
Nicely done, Mahendra Prabhu. Narada Muni.
I was thinking something along what you were saying, Prabhu, about I was looking at this verse in 37. It says, because he has achieved his real identity, the perfectly realized soul has no conception of how the material body is moving or acting, just as an intoxicated person cannot understand whether or not he has clothing on his body. And I was thinking of that verse in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu where it talks about how the person who's on the platform of bhava isn't even contaminated by the external activities of the body. And I just find it such a profound thing to think about, that just a remembrance that the self is totally apart from the mind and the body in that experience.
Thank you, Narada Muni. And now we have the outside people. I'm scanning the audience. Don't see any hands. Anything? Yes. We'll give you the mic. Otherwise nobody can hear you outside or online.
Hare Krishna. In one of the purports, I was thinking about this very seriously. As long as the mind is in the material consciousness, it must be forcibly trained to accept meditation on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But when one is actually elevated to loving the Supreme Lord, the mind is automatically absorbed in thoughts of the Lord. I was just feeling, I was trying to correlate my situation to one of the stages of bhakti, and I really have to force myself to focus on my sadhana. And then we were all talking about bhav and higher stages. It just makes me realize that I am at a very lower stage, probably at bhajana kriya or anartha nivritti, because I'm not even at the stage of nishtha or steadiness yet. So it makes me realize that I have a very long way to go, because it's a lot of effort that I require to perform my sadhana. Doesn't flow very easily.
Yeah, that's always a nice revelation, to have a sense of how far along we are. At the same time, because the process is the Kevala Ananda Kanda, there's not a sense of complete agony, or although there may be to some degree. There are several verses in which Krishna describes how we should respond to finding ourselves in an interim space. That is, we have faith. If we have faith in hearing, like Jatashada Makatasu Nirguna Sarvakarmasu Veda Dukatmakam Kamams Pratyagye Pyanishvara describes the person who is fully convinced about the efficacy of hearing and chanting, has shraddha for Krishna Katha, and also has a sense of disgust for material activities, and also Veda Dukatmakam Kamams, knows that they all lead to misery, but still Pratyagye Pyanishvara, the person doesn't have the power to overcome the mind that's still stuck in that pattern. And Krishna says, Tato bhajeta mam prita shraddha lurjana nishchaya jushamanams tatam kamams dukho darkam shagarayan. The last word, garayan, means you can be a little bit appalled at your own inability, but not so much so that you become discouraged, because Krishna says, Tatoba Jaitamam Prita, keep going. I always think of it as, in every process there is a time at which it seems impossible. In any discipline. For instance, let's say writing a book. It seems impossible. I mean, even writing a pamphlet is hard. What to speak of a book? And then, at one stage, at least speaking for myself, at one stage, or for a long time, the book seems amorphous. Some ideas are there, but they're all in their own orbits. And then there's a time at which I realize I have to do this, so I can't stop, but I also don't know how it's going to happen, how it'll all come together. And my experience of that activity, that discipline, is I've described it to myself as swimming in the ocean and not knowing when I'm going to reach the shore. But what can I do? I got to keep swimming. You can't stop. You just have to keep going. And then there's a sense that, others have done it, and there's so many statements in the Vedas. In fact, there's one exactly like that Akrura quotes when he's on his way to see Krishna. And he says that the living entities are floating like logs. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu quotes that section also. He said, but there is a time in which they come to the shore. And so keeping that in mind, and also being vigilant to practice properly, because there is a way in which, as we've been discussing here lately in Niyamagraha, one can be practicing but not mindfully. And then, as Chaitanya Charan Prabhu once said, man signs up for the gym, goes in, lifts some weights, and he goes home and says, I'm really sore and it's really hard lifting weights. I should keep the gym membership, but I'll go there and just move my arms. I won't actually lift anything. So one could then, for instance, with chanting, he was giving that example. It's like, it's a good idea, but I'm not focusing the mind is hard, so I'm not going to do that part of it. Anyway, we all are appreciating your, description, because to one degree or another, everyone knows what it means to struggle with the mind. And it's although it seems like a long time, the descriptions here are so encouraging in that it's altogether possible. And in some statements Prabhupada has made today and yesterday, it's not that far. You just switch from thinking of your own sense gratification to Krishna. Does somebody have their hand up out there? Yes, but it's so dark there. It's hard to see who it is.
Hare Krishna. I have a question on text.
Oh, it's Vaishnavi. Okay, sorry, I couldn't see you. Go ahead, Vaishnavi.
On 3:28:39, it was talking about how when one has real knowledge, prati-buddha, where one sees that one's sons and one's wealth is different from himself. I was just remembering the pastime where Queen Kunti says that she's praying to Krishna to take away this attachment for her sons, who are actually great Vaishnavas, so that skin disease. So how is that practically applicable to us? Because someone of Queen Kunti's caliber is even praying to show us that attachment is so strong, even with us as aspiring devotees, those who are near and dear to us, or family connection. So how do we practically see that? What's the mindset of having the proper vision of that?
Well, in one place, yes, it's such an important question. And thank you for quoting Queen Kunti. There's a way in which Prabhupada describes, in a very straightforward way, that one should see everything in the world as paraphernalia to be used in service to the Lord. So rather than thinking of this arduous prospect of detaching oneself from those who are so dear to us, militantly. It's like, I'm going to cut that off. There is a way in which when we are more service-oriented towards whoever it is, our own mind and body, or whatever possessions we have, our bank balance, that's right up there with the all-time greatest attachments. And then there's family members. But if one, as Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, Jiv Krishna Das, E Bishwas, Korleto or Dukonai, if one just thinks, there's all for service. For instance, there's a husband and wife, and they think, well, what is our relationship? We serve together. If there are relatives that we're attached to, when the relationship becomes connected to service, then there's a natural way in which we start to develop perspective, which is another way of saying detachment. Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayojita Jani Ayashu Vairagyam Gyanam Charyaraitukam. There's a natural way when one's rendering service to Krishna that sort of detachment arises in one's heart, because one has what this chapter is describing, a one-mindedness with Krishna. And Krishna's, as Prabhupada was just saying, he's all joyful all the time. And nobody else is in this material world, no matter what they do. Everyone's always in heavy anxiety. And even Prahlad says, especially when they start thinking about how to enjoy. So if there's a way in which, instead of thinking like, how am I going to cut all this out? Of course, what is going to do? Ata vishvesha vishvat mam vishvamurti sukeshu me sneha pasha mimam chindi dridam pandushu vishnishu. She's praying to the Lord, please help me with this. So that's, you said, how can we do this? Or how can we expect to do this? Yeah, with the Lord's mercy it's possible, and if we just think in all circumstances, this is paraphernalia to be used in Krishna's service. And if we do that, then there's a natural way in which the relationship becomes more blissful and naturally detached, without saying like, yeah, I can't talk to you anymore, and or being cold and distant to your family members, which the Bhagavatam specifically says don't do. That's Narada to Vasudeva at the end of the 7th canto. He's saying that if you're a householder, you have family members, don't treat them coldly. You should treat them with affection, otherwise they'll die. That's what the relationship's all about. Internally, you can it can be cultivated, but you're not it, meaning a sense of detachment, but that's based on what I was saying earlier about service. Vaishnavi? Yes. Ananda Tirtha Prabhu.
This verse here, that the Supreme Super Soul seated in everybody's heart, and the yogi should see the same soul in all manifestations, for all that exists is a manifestation of the different energies of the Supreme. In this way, the devotee should see all living entities without distinction. That is the realization of the Supreme Soul. You were telling about, not being cold to, people. So I was just reflecting a few minutes before that, how even in the devotee community, when we have differences, okay, it's a family, so we have differences. This realization actually is very important, because that is how I am meant to reciprocate, understand that the super soul is there in the other living entity's heart as well. And the surrender actually, it's an opportunity for me to exercise my surrender by not trying to manipulate, by not trying to even butter something, somebody, but just do your service dutifully, and not have any ill feelings towards anybody, because of the because the Lord is seated in their heart, and at the same time I generally also see a lot of devotees quite not having this aspect clear, in the sense that shouldn't they be always, because Krishna does say dukkhalayam ashashvatam, material world is temporary and miserable, but he also says susukham kartam avyayam, joyfully performed. So isn't that this aspect of realizing that the super soul is seated in your heart and he is there to guide you should excite us as well? Because the deities, we offer service to the deities, but I think they interact from the super soul, guidance comes from the super soul level as well. So shouldn't this aspect be a prominent one to develop for the devotees to, whether be it facing obstacles or be it relationship with devotees or be it in their service, this aspect of the guidance from the super soul?
Oh yes, absolutely. And what you're indicating is a sense of respect for others based on the fact that the super soul's there, which is a point that Krishna makes himself in various places, not the least of which is in the 11th canto when he's teaching Uddhava about bhakti. So many chapters there about gyan and karma, they're huge. And then when you get to the bhakti chapter, it's tiny. And there's one section there where Krishna says that bhakti means to have this sense of respect for all living beings. And he said a Vaishnav has so much respect for every living being that he'll even offer obeisances to a dog, sensing that Krishna's there within the heart. And that is one of the main principles. I was also thinking of the ways in which Krishna, in the 12th chapter of the Gita, near the end, speaks about how one should interact with others. For instance, don't become your enemy's enemy, or tolerate when you don't get what you want. And these are all seemingly commonsensical, but they also lead to this sense of, I'm not the controller, and if somebody else offends me, then let Krishna work it out. Of course, we also have to interact and communicate properly, but when we have that sense that you're talking about of respect for others, and that Krishna's observing what's going on and so forth, then we're able to communicate properly, so we're not offensive.
Yeah, we'll probably stop complaining about things, and even Dharma, when Parikshit Maharaj asked him why you have only one leg, he refused to blame anybody. And he gave a list of reasons that could be this, but he never...
Yeah. Sign of somebody seeing spiritually. Yeah. Thank you, Prabhu. It's very helpful. Okay, Devrata and then Bhanabhata Prabhu, and I'm looking outside, and is that Sarva? Sarva, go ahead. Because we have to respect the outside people's party. Is that Sarva? Oh, it's a Kulavecha Sridhar. I couldn't tell because you have your chadar over your head like Sarva wears sometimes.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
It's about this verse 41 at the purport. At the last part it says, the four principles of the Vaishnava philosophic doctrine are Suddha, Advaita, purified oneness, Dvaita, Advaita, simultaneous oneness and difference, Viṣishta, Advaita, and Dvaita. I just want to ask you about this Viṣishta, Advaita, and Dvaita. If you can please elaborate a little about this.
Dvaita comes from Madhva, and he was known for his, this is not the hippie thing from the 60s for peace. It's like he strongly emphasized the difference. All of them, it's progression of that's coming to the perfection in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's presentation of Achinta Bheda Bheda Tattva. The thrust of all of those commentaries is to defeat the Mayavadis, because all the Vaishnavas knows that's the death knell to bhakti, as the presentation of Mayavad philosophy. So they all present like that. That in all of these, they're very nuanced. Well, I can speak for myself. In trying to study the details of these, I became very bored, because they're not great detail. They're not highly pronounced details in the different philosophies. So the main point is that they're advocating for the difference between the Lord and the living entity, and that you don't, and they don't. They're a bulwark against the Mayavad, and I can't give you more information than that between Vishishta Dvaita and the Dvaita at this point, because I wasn't interested enough to really memorize what was happening in those different philosophies. Did you have a point?
Yeah, it was just a point about purification and the struggle with the mind. I was speaking with my friend Krishna Loka Prabhu, who's lived in Vrindavan for the past 30 years. He's a disciple. Govardhan, you're right next to Krishna, so everything's going to be coming out. But he was giving the perspective that, with how we've been cultivating anarthas, and he gave the explanation for pralaya after pralaya after pralaya. We've been cultivating anarthas within our heart. He said it's a small price to pay for us to undergo 20, 30, 40 years of intense purification for wiping out all those anarthas which have been cultivated in the course of all those pralayas. So it was such a relief to me to think that the purification, it may be a challenge, but if we're really trying to be humble, we're trying to be tolerant and apply the process, it's very short in relationship to how much time we've put into cultivating these unwanted things.
Nice. Thank you very much. Brings us to Bana. Okay. We have 2 minutes left.
I really liked in verse 35 where Prabhupada was talking about how when the mind is completely purified in love of Godhead, the mind becomes the mind of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And that is a wonderful kind of meditation, especially because in the conditioned state, the mind, of course, being the central point of the whole yoga practice, it gives so much trouble to the conditioned soul. But to think at some point where it becomes the mind of the Supreme Personality of God sounds very inspiring. And also down here, where it says that it says similarly, when the mind stops functioning on the material platform, it is conserved in the activities of the Supreme Lord. Without fully understanding what that says, just that it sounds like just a wonderful meditation to actually just consider that.
Well, really, in the context, is what it means is that we're always active. Tafivit nahi kashit shanamapi jatatishyatya karma karete yavasha karma sarva prakriti jarganai. There's no time when we're not active. Even when we sleep, we're still active and so forth. But then that same activity is conserved within the process of devotional service, because the activity is going on. The energy, it's not that it's stopped. It's the opposite of the idea that nirvana, which is what the next example probably gives, the idea is the fire's still there, it's just conserved. It's a physics idea, a conservation of energy. So the same thing, the energy of the soul, it's never extinguished, it's only remanifested into the service attitude with Krishna.
I mean, to me it appears what it's saying is that the mind more or less becomes inactive because it's like it merges in a sense with Krishna's mind. So Krishna's mind kind of it like takes over the activities of our conditioned mind. I don't know that
it becomes one. This section says in the sense of cooperation, in the sense of my only idea is to serve Krishna's desire. So there's no separation between the two things.
Right, but it says that actually the mind becomes the mind of the personality of Godhead.
Right, because we're part and parcel anyway. And when the mind is really absorbed in the idea of I'm the servant of Krishna, then it's like Krishna describes in the Bhagavad Gita how then all the intelligence that we're getting is coming from Krishna. It's Krishna's ideas, and it's not some diverted sense that I'm under the control of the material nature. Like Mahatmanastam Mamparta Daivim Prakritim Ashrita. It's like the shelter under the internal energy. I'm just trying to avoid going into like a sense of merging. I guess I'm afraid of that. It's like of taking that out of the context of the other aspects and saying like, okay, somebody can misinterpret that and say, like, okay, yeah, well then, aren't you kind of the Lord now because your mind is the Lord's mind? That's my attempt is just preserving that idea.
Yeah. But it seems to me to indicate that the energy of the mind, but the mind's not functioning. Like the material mind is not functioning. It's the spiritual mind, or the mind of Krishna that's functioning, and it becomes like I don't know exactly, but it seems like it's not being utilized.
That's true. The material mind it becomes superfluous. It's not needed anymore because there's no engagement for it. The only engagement in the material mind is the agent of the material mind is the three modes of material nature, and when those aren't there, then all you have is the spiritually oriented mind, which means service oriented.
It's a little bit difficult for me to understand because up to that, even after it was talking about how, with the purified mind, we act in Krishna consciousness, and how.
Well, just consider that with bhakti, you always have to have the Lord as the and the person who's serving, and then there's the bhakti in between. The three things have to be there. If you want to, you can read it. Which verse is it?
We don't have to take any more time. I just thought it was, it's fascinating.
I was enamored of that part too, because what I felt when I heard that was a sense of relief. Just in chanting japa and then observing the mind and the false ego, and then noticing that when I'm able to separate from the mind and the false ego and observe that it's going on, and then see, oh, there's a refuge in the holy name, which is Krishna is right there, and there's all these other entities, and if even for a fraction of a second I'm able to notice that, I feel such relief because I'm not under assault or just being carried away by the currents of the false ego in the mind. And so when I heard that, I felt that's the complete absorption, where I could go back to what we heard yesterday when Prabhupada was talking about how when you go into when the mind is active, even when you're sleeping and you're dreaming, he said you're lost because you're not aware of the fact that you're there as part and parcel of Krishna. But he said you're never lost, and that's the sense of merging with Krishna is that there is only Krishna, and there's only service to Krishna. And then all my ideas that were competing ideas, because I was trying to find some enjoyment outside of Krishna, bhayam dvitiya binibesha tasyad, and it's a fearful and very difficult situation. All that stops, and it becomes, I'm only merged in the joy of serving Krishna. And the mind becomes one because I have no other separate interests besides serving Krishna.
Thank you.
Dear Srila Prabhupada, dear Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shri Shri Panchatattva, Shri Shri Radha Madan Mohan, if you so desire, please let our minds become one with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thank you for considering our request. Om Tat Sat. Everyone agrees with this prayer in part or in whole. Please unmute and say Hare Krishna. Gaur Premanande, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Nitai Gaura Hari Bol. Vanchakalptarishcha kripa sindhaveva cha patitanam pavanibhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha.